Trap it up, podcast, trap it up, tattoo. Okay, y'all. I keep saying I'm going to get this theme song. I still ain't got it. So here we are, just me saying random songs that I like because it feels right. So welcome back to another episode of the Podcast Trapper. I am your host, Anna Agogo, founder of Black Pod Collective, Black Pod Festival, and Adode Media, a full-service podcast production agency, studio, all the things in one. And I'm excited for this episode because, my episodes are pretty brief, short to the point, because I'm not trying to just be here taking up time to take up time. And this week, I really want to touch on the power of niching down your podcast. So, for example, as you know, this is called the Podcast Trapper. And the reason for that, because people are like, oh, are you going to be teaching me about podcasting? Surely not. This is not a how-to podcast. That is what Black Pod Collective, the podcast, is all about. It is a how-to podcast for podcasters. Shameless plug. So if you know that you want to learn about podcasting, that's where you need to head over to. So we provide tips, tricks, how-tos, all those things. Over on this side of the house with the Podcast Trapper, it's more so me talking about my experiences. And right now, one of the big things with having a studio, trust me when I say I hear so many different podcasts. Matthew's behind the cameras right now, and he just gave me a face because, baby, we see a little bit of everything. And people talk about any and everything, and their podcast is about everything. And that's partly why my podcast is called the Podcast Trapper, that's talking about the podcast space, but not talking about podcasting. I'm sure you've probably picked up on that by now. And I want to kind of guide you and provide my experiences, not tell you how to, around what that looks like and why it's important to niche down your podcast. So, for example, when I first jumped in the podcasting space, I had a podcast called Fierce Ass Boss. Baby, if that wasn't me, aren't I fierce? Ain't I bossy? Yeah, it felt right. And quite frankly, I wanted to talk to women who had left corporate America and all these things, but I didn't really have a niche. Like, I talked to anybody. It didn't matter what. I talked to somebody who had a bakery. I had talked to somebody who had a store. I talked to somebody who was a PR rep. I spoke to anybody who was willing to be on my podcast because guess what? I didn't understand the power of niching it down. And that's the thing. I think oftentimes we want to have shows that just kind of fixate on the things that we're interested in, one, but two, it's hard to find guests on your podcast. I mean, think about it. My shows and my episodes are 15 minutes because, baby, I can't talk beyond that. What else am I going to talk to you about? I'm here by myself just talking at a camera with a mic with Matthew just staring at me. That's a lot. And so with that in mind, I think people often just start searching for anybody to have on their show. And guess what? That's fine too. But it all depends on the purpose of your podcast. If you're trying to utilize it as a brand generator, as a funnel, as a way to get your message to the world, you kind of have to narrow that down a little bit. Like, I don't know who I heard this from, but I'd like to say I coined it. Don't come for me if I didn't. That if you're talking to everybody, you are talking to nobody. And that's the truth about not having a niche for your podcast. You are literally just talking into the abyss and hoping that anybody finds you. And typically that anybody is your mama, because mamas love us. Okay. Thank you, God, for that. That's typically who the person is who's consistently tuning in and supporting you and all of those things. But in actuality, you have to have a target audience. Telling somebody that their target audience or your target audience is anybody, pretty much anybody who come and listen to your podcast, that's your target audience. Well, that's unrealistic. And quite frankly, you're going to lose people's interest after a while because what I'm interested in versus what Matthew's interested in, drastically different. And having an understanding of what my interests are, what are the things that I like to do, like to enjoy. This plays a role in figuring out what type of content you need to cover for your podcast. Hence why it's the power of niching. I never know. Is it niching or niching? The riches are in the niches. I don't know. Y'all know what I mean. The next piece to that is if you're like me, who I say I am multi-talented or just curious, because who knows if I'm really talented in all these things, it can be difficult to find your niche. It can be difficult to pick just one topic to talk about. And so then you find yourself in this conundrum of like, well, then I need a whole other podcast where I talk about this. And this podcast, I only talk about that. No, that's not what anybody's saying when we say the power of niching or the importance of having a niche or the importance of having a target audience. Really, you should start looking at it for overarching topics. Prime example with the Podcast Trapper, I talk about entrepreneurship. I talk about the podcasting space. I talk about podcast reports, podcast communities, events. I give a little razzle dazzle about how to do certain things. But guess what the commonality is? It's podcasting. I'm giving these experiences and these takes on entrepreneurship as content creators from the perspective of a podcaster, from the perspective of a podcast producer, from the perspective of a podcast community builder. And so my niche and my area of focus is podcasting, but I then have all of these subtopics and content pillars around entrepreneurship, podcast, community. Those are my content pillars. Those are my subtopics for the overarching topic of podcasting. So as I look at what content am I going to have for this podcast? What content am I going to have on social media? What content am I going to have for my blog? It is all focused around podcasting, but the various elements that are a part of my experience in the podcast space. So I say this because that's how I want more people to start looking at their content. Everybody should not have a Sex and Society podcast. Let me say it again. Everybody should not have a Sex and Society podcast. And everybody shouldn't be talking about sex on every single episode. But if you know that you want to talk about male-female relationships, not just in a toxic capacity, then it's okay to say that you're talking about relationships as an overarch. And then sometimes you talk about mother-daughter relationships. You talk about, significant other, coworker, boss, subordinate, contractor, so on and so forth. You can then talk about a gambit of things under that umbrella because you can touch on more people, which is typically the issue when we're like, oh, I have so many interests. But yes, there's a huge but here. I've listened to some podcasts who are clients who, booked the studio, who started off with, talking about sex and relationship. Then they go into talking about current events based off of what's going on in the shade room, not current political events. Then they go into talking about the news. That's a little bit too choppy. You're going a little bit too all over the place. And I always like to remind people that podcasting is a companion tool. And by companion tool, it means that most people are doing something when they listen to certain shows. I have certain shows that I listen to when I am doing laundry and cleaning my house. I have other shows when I'm getting the studio ready for a client. And I have completely other shows when I am sitting in traffic because, baby, you got to put me in Zen. And that's the difference. Like understanding what you are a companion tool to. And if I normally listen to you to put me in my Zen state and I'm, just sipping a glass of wine, I was about to say bottle of wine. Hopefully that's never the case. But sipping a glass of wine, soaking in the tub and just relaxing. And I typically come to you for my relaxation. Like you normally do meditation and all of these things. And then this day you decide you about to turn up on here and be talking about anything that happened in the shade room. I'm going to be looking like, excuse me, what is you doing? And that's the piece. Like you want to become a part of your audience's routine. And what do I hope that you guys are doing as you listen to my podcast? Let me think about this one. I hope each of you, when you are listening to my podcast, you are turning it up in the car. Yep, that's what I said. Or you're at your desk at work and it's a drab day and you tired of your coworkers are kind of getting on your nerves and you just need to hear my voice till I kind of get you through so you can laugh a little bit. That's what I hope I'm the companion tool for. And so when you're thinking of your niche, you have to think of what are you the companion tool for? What feelings do you want your audience to have as they're listening to your podcast or as they're looking at the visuals? What feelings should it evoke? I know like with my first few episodes, somebody was like, your personality is so bright, so loud, all of these things. And what the promo I was seeing didn't match in you in that black blazer. And I was offended. I was like, excuse me, I can dress up sometimes too. I too can be a lady. And they're like, no, it's not that. It's the visuals didn't match the feeling that I was expecting with your show. And that's the thing about having a niche is that you create visuals, you create a sound, you create topics around what you want your audience to feel and see when they think of your show. And so I think there's immense power in that because the fact that most of my favorite shows, they may not have the best sound quality. Yep, I said it. My favorite show actually doesn't have amazing sound quality. However, they are very specific. It is a niche podcast. It speaks to my spirit. It talks about the Nigerian experience, living in America, living back home, all of those things. That is very specific. But they touch on so many different topics about the Nigerian experience. And that's what I want to see more people doing. I want you to actually start talking about something that speaks to me in a specific way, because you're never going to be able to touch on every facet of me as an individual. But if you're able to tap into that one portion, maybe you got me hook, line, and sinker. I don't know if that's how the saying goes. I'm actually not good with American sayings. So hook, like, and sinkered. Nope. We're going to give up on that. And we're going to actually leave it in, because you should just know that this is how I am. And so I really hope that in 2023 and beyond, I want to see more podcasters, more Black podcasters to be specific as well, niche down a little bit more. Like Sex and Society, or Society and Culture is actually what it's called, but I just say Sex and Society at this point because that's what everybody wants to talk about. But Society and Culture tends to be what everybody's creating because it's what they see on the Shade Room. It's the ones that get the most salacious plays and everything like that, and everybody's talking about it, when in actuality, we need to start hearing more stories about, our narrative, like our experience as Black people. We need to start seeing more people talk about history podcasts, more science, more true crime. I mean, not saying I want people to be killing each other, but you know what I meant. And those type of things. Like, that's what I want to start seeing more of in the space. But that's the power of having a niche podcast, is that you can be what people go to when they're ready for that particular topic. So if you're interested in looking at, like, how do I niche my podcast? Like, how do I niche down? I will probably be doing a few Instagram lives and a few other details around how to niche your podcast and how to determine what your niche should be. Because when you have so many passions, it's very hard to know, which one should you focus in on? So if you're interested in that support, head over to Adode Media. I've been doing a few IG lives there. Adode's ADODE. If you're interested in just kind of seeing how I've been able to kind of segment each of my brands, because Black Pod Collective is very specific for community. Black Pod Festival, very much so the event. On a Go-Go, very much so my own individual brand. Adode Media, so on and so forth. Feel free to just kind of check each of those out, because seeing respective brands all created by the same person can give you an idea of how you can segment off and create some of that for yourself. So hope you found this information helpful. Hope you found this entertaining, because, that's what I want. I want to be able to share my thoughts while also entertaining you just a tidbit. So until next week, you guys feel free to make sure that you tune in. This is an audio-visual based podcast, so make sure you head over to YouTube, listen to it on Apple, Castbox, wherever you listen to podcasts. We are there. And leave a review, share it, tell a friend to tell a friend that the podcast trap it up, trap. I know. Don't worry. I'm going to get a song. Until next time, have a good one.